Committee will come to order. On Wednesday, the President submitted to Congress his proposal for an authorization to use military force against ISIS. Although the President's ordered combat operations against ISIS take place in Iraq since last August and in Syria since last September, only now has he sought the congressional authorization required by the Constitution. Despite the airstrikes, press accounts indicate that ISIS has expanded its territory that it controls in Syria. The world has been horrified at its barbarism, which seems to have no limit. In the meantime, the United States has suffered a significant setback in Yemen. We've abandoned our embassy there, a place which the President once held out as a model for his counterterrorism approach. Now we're in a much weaker position to prevent attacks by the organization that has posed the most serious threat to our homeland in recent years. Elsewhere, Boko Haram is killing thousands and steadily advancing in Nigeria. Libya has become a breeding ground for terrorist groups. AQIM still menaces the population in several North African countries. And there is concern that al-Qaeda in the Afghan-Pakistan region is becoming reinvigorated as U.S. troop levels are reduced. Congress will consider the President's AUMF proposal in the context of this wider fight against Islamist terrorists. The purpose of today's hearing is to evaluate how that broader struggle is going. Among the questions I have are, what are the trends we see with Islamist terrorists? Is their appeal growing or diminishing around the world? Is the threat to the United States becoming more or less serious? Many in Congress want reassurances that the President has a strategy to succeed against this threat and that he is personally committed to persevere until we are successful. It's clear that before we are successful, we've got to understand the threat, where we are, and where we're headed. That's the purpose of today's hearing. Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I thank the Chairman for this hearing on this very important topic. I think it is the largest national security threat that we face as a country. I know all three of our panelists have a lot of knowledge on the issue, and I think it will be very helpful for the committee to hear from them and engage in questions and answers as we try to figure out how to confront this threat. And part of the problem with the threat is it is not easy to define and it's not easy to put a strategy around because it really is a broad ideology that has many, many different components. Post 9/11, we saw al-Qaeda as a terrorist group with a centralized leadership that was plotting and planning attacks against us, and I think responded accordingly to try and defeat that organization, to try and defeat that network, and did a reasonably effective job of it in Afghanistan and in Pakistan as we prevented that group from being able to mount further attacks against us. That's the positive. The negative is that the ideology itself has metastasized. It has grown into a number of the groups that the Chairman mentioned and even more than that in a lot of different places. And the root cause is a lack of solid governance, a lack of solid economic opportunity in the Middle East and North Africa and much of the Arab Muslim world. They have an exploding youth population that has nothing to do, no jobs and no prospects. So the ideology that comes along and says, I have the answer for you, has plenty of willing recruits, and meanwhile they don't have much in the way of an example of a good government anywhere that they could look to and work with. So it's going to be very difficult to contain this. I think the Chairman laid out, the challenges with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the collapse in Yemen, the difficulties in Libya. But overall, I think we need a long-term strategy. And one of the things that I think has hampered us is this notion that we have to be able to confidently say either A, that we're winning, or that we are going to win, and here's how. I honestly think that this is a long-term ideological struggle, not something that we can say, we're determined to defeat it, so let's just suck it up and 3 or 4 years from now it'll be done. It took 75 years to defeat communism. I think we have to figure out how to have a long-term strategy for dealing with this ideology. Now, that doesn't mean that in the short term the ideology runs rampant. Huge piece of that strategy is containing the threat, figuring out how to protect our interests from violence, and figuring out how to begin to roll back these groups and roll back the advance of their ideology. But it is an issue that defies an easy answer. So what we hope to hear today is some ideas on how we can proceed and move forward, mindful of the fact that it is a very, very large problem that's going to take a long time to deal with. And the final point that I will make, one of the things that hamstrings us, is it's not something the U.S. or the Western world can take care of. The Muslim world does not want the United States to show up and tell it what it ought to do. And this is true even of the moderate Muslims that we look to work with. We have to figure out how we can be helpful to support those moderate voices so that they can triumph, so that they can defeat these extremist ideologies. It cannot be Western-driven by the very definition of the way those folks look at the world. So we can help, but if we help too much in an odd sort of way, we wind up hurting the overall effort. I think that's the lesson we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. So with that, I look forward to the testimony, the questions, and I appreciate the Chairman holding the committee, or the hearing, I should say.
I thank the gentleman. I just mentioned to members that I think we're supposed to have votes on the floor roughly around 10:40, 10:45, and so I'm going to try to be fairly strict with the time limits so we can move along smartly. I ask unanimous consent that the full written statement of all of our witnesses be made part of the record without objection so ordered. Let me again thank our witnesses for being here. Very pleased to see retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. William Braniff, Executive Director, National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism with the University of Maryland, and Dr. Mark Lynch with the George Washington University. All of these gentlemen have done very serious, helpful work for the committee and for the country on this topic of terrorism, and we're very grateful to have you with us today. As I said, your full written statement will be made part of the record. If you'd like to summarize at this point, and then we'll get to questions, we'd appreciate it. General Flynn.
Great, thank you. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, it is an honor to be here today, and I really appreciate the invitation. You have asked me to comment on the state of Islamic extremism. Today, I have the unhappy task of informing you that according to every metric of significance, Islamic extremism has grown over the last year, whether it be the scale and scope of ISIS and its associated movements, the number of violent Islamist groups, the territory which these groups control, the number of terrorist attacks these groups perpetrate, the massive numbers and suffering of refugees and displaced persons due to these Islamist groups. That's approximately 15 million people. The amount of kidnapping and rape of women and children by these groups, the numbers of casualties they inflict, their broad expansion and use of the Internet, which is very serious, or just their sheer barbarism that we've witnessed. I can draw no other conclusion than to say that the threat of Islamic extremism has reached an unacceptable level and that it is growing. We are at war with violent and extreme Islamists, both Sunni and Shia, and we must accept and face this reality. This enemy has an ingrained and unshakable vision of how the world and society should be ordered, and they believe violence is a legitimate means of bringing about this ideal state. The violent Islamist is serious, devout, committed, and dangerous. His ideology justifies the most heinous, inhumane actions imaginable, and he will not be reasoned with, nor will he relent. This enemy must be opposed, they must be killed, they must be destroyed, and the associated extremist form of the Islamic ideology must be defeated wherever it rears its ugly head. There are some who counsel patience, arguing violent Islamists are not an existential threat and therefore can simply be managed as criminals. I respectfully and strongly disagree. I have been in the theaters of war of Iraq and Afghanistan for many years, faced this enemy up close and personal, and I have seen firsthand the unrestrained cruelty of this enemy. They may be animated by a medieval ideology, but they are thoroughly modern in their capacity to kill and maim, as well as precisely and very smartly message their ideas, intentions, and actions via the Internet. In fact, they are increasingly capable of threatening our nation's interests and those of our allies. Furthermore, it would be foolish for us to wait until our enemies pose an existential threat before taking decisive action. Doing so would only increase the cost in blood and treasure later for what we know must be done now. Our violent and extremely radical Islamist enemies must be stopped. To that end, I offer the following three strategic objectives. First, we have to energize every element of national power, similar to the effort during World War II or during the Cold War, to effectively resource what will likely be a multi-generational struggle. There is no cheap way to win this fight. Second, we must engage the violent Islamists wherever they are, drive them from their safe havens, and kill them. There can be no quarter and no accommodation for this vicious group of terrorists. Any nation state that offers safe haven to our enemies must be given one choice: to eliminate them or be prepared for those contributing partners involved in this endeavor to do so. We do need to recognize there are nations who lack the capability to defeat this threat and will likely require help to do so inside of their own internationally recognized boundaries. We must be prepared to assist those nations. Third, we must decisively confront the state and non-state supporters and enablers of the violent Islamist ideology and compel them to end their support to our enemies or be prepared to remove their capacity to do so. Many of these are currently considered partners of the United States. This must change. If our so-called partners do not act in accordance with internationally accepted norms and behaviors or international law, the United States must be prepared to cut off or severely curtail economic, military, and diplomatic ties. We cannot be seen as being hypocritical to those we are partnering with to defeat radical Islam. Finally, in pursuit of these objectives, I fully support Congress's constitutional role in providing an authorization for the use of military force. This authorization should be broad and agile, but unconstrained by unnecessary restrictions that today cause not only frustration in our military, our intelligence, and our diplomatic communities, but also significantly slow down the decision-making process for numerous fleeting opportunities. It is important, however, to realize that such an authorization is neither a comprehensive strategy nor a war-winning one. If there is not a clear, coherent, and comprehensive strategy forthcoming from the administration, there should be no authorization. With that, Chairman, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, General. Mr. Brannan.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and esteemed members of the committee, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the START Consortium for inviting us to speak with you today. In 2013, over 22,000 people were killed in nearly 8,500 terrorist attacks. When START releases the full global terrorism database data set for 2014, we anticipate it will include over 15,000 terrorist attacks. Our preliminary data from the first 9 months of 2014 suggest that 7 of the 10 most lethal groups in 2014 were violent jihadist groups, and ISIL among them conducted more terrorist attacks than any other terrorist organization. The trend lines over the last few years are largely driven by 2 factors. First, the proliferation of groups associated with al-Qaeda in hotspots around the world, and second, the rise of ISIL and its strategy of escalation through sectarian violence. What we have, therefore, is the makings of a global competition involving the most violent terrorist organizations in the world. This is even more troubling when one considers that both the theoretical and empirical work in the terrorism studies field suggests that competition among terrorist groups is one of the most important predictors of increasing lethality over time. To better understand this competition and its implications, I'd like to contrast the operations and strategies of al-Qaeda and its associated movement, or AQAM, with those of ISIL. Al-Qaeda is waging a protracted war of attrition against the West, specifically aiming to bleed the United States. If they're able to attrit the American economic, military, or political will to remain engaged in the Muslim world, local jihadists can overpower apostate regimes and establish what they would consider to be proper theocracies. To wage this war of attrition, al-Qaeda has sent operatives into conflict zones across the world to reorient the violence of militant organizations and individuals, refocusing their wrath on far enemy targets like Western embassies or tourist destinations. Al-Qaeda seeks to use spectacular mass casualty attacks to incite heavy-handed military responses from Western and apostate governments that seemingly evidence the war on Islam that al-Qaeda portrays in its propaganda, thereby polarizing the Muslim and the non-Muslim worlds and enabling jihadists to mobilize for a civilizational conflict. ISIL is not currently waging a war of attrition, but one of escalation. Instead of inviting Muslim versus Western violence, it is benefiting from the resources already being mobilized by sectarian polarization that is taking place in Iraq and Syria and beyond, which it actively seeks to exacerbate. Instead of the far enemy, ISIL's military operations have focused on attacking competitors in their midst who do not submit to their ideological and organizational primacy, and seizing the resources necessary to build the institutions of the caliphate. So given this competition, there are several implications for U.S. policy and regional security. The first, whereas Al-Qaeda's far enemy strategy relies on provocation to polarize and mobilize the masses, ISIL is ratcheting up already elevated levels of sectarian tension in the post-Arab Spring world. The continued presence of the Assad regime in Syria serves as a more salient rallying cry for ISIL than for AQAM. And broad anti-Assad sentiment in Sunni-majority countries helps to dampen those governments' responses to both ISIL and groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliate. As sectarian tensions remain high, ISIL and aligned jihadist groups will foster and exploit those tensions. ISIL veterans will travel to new fronts outside of Iraq and Syria, bringing their escalation strategy and sectarianism with them. In a worst-case scenario, this contagion effect runs the risk of inciting a sectarian civil war in the Muslim world, relegating the West to the role of observer, poorly positioned to take any meaningful action to protect itself or others. In addition, every new ISIL front opens up a new set of grievance narratives and a new set of mobilization pathways for terrorist organizations seeking to radicalize and recruit foreign fighters. 3, both ISIL and AQAM have incentives to conduct attacks against the West as part of this competition. For ISIL, attacks against the West can be used as a form of deterrence, making foreign countries think twice or pay the price for large-scale military interventions in Iraq and Syria. We cannot be fooled into thinking that al-Qaeda's focus on the caliphate prevents them from actively seeking the capability to conduct attacks against the homeland. For al-Qaeda and its associated movement, ISIL's antagonistic rise to prominence has created a crisis of legitimacy, incentivizing them to use far enemy attacks to regain the spotlight. Furthermore, if ISIL continues to murder Muslims and overstep its bounds, as we've recently seen with respect to the murder of a Jordanian pilot, al-Qaeda and its associated movement might wind up looking more legitimate and mainstream by comparison, as long as they remain focused on the true enemies of Islam, the West. We cannot, therefore, take pressure off of AQAM. To conclude, we're seeing an escalating competition among violent Sunni extremist groups at a time when sectarian tensions are high and many governments' hold on legitimacy is weak. It is essential, therefore, that any U.S. strategy prioritizes working with Sunni nations and communities to marginalize violent Sunni extremists. To do this, the U.S. must find a way to ease sectarian tensions and earn the trust of our Sunni partners, allowing them to focus their attention on marginalizing groups like ISIL and AQAM. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lynch.
First, I'd like to thank Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and the whole committee. It's a real honor to be on this panel and to have the chance to speak with you. So, as you've heard from my colleagues, ISIL poses a serious threat to American interests, to the people of the region, to our partners in the region. And, of course, it's extremely important to not underestimate the nature of the threat or to misunderstand the nature of the threat. I think it's important, however, to not perhaps exaggerate its novelty or perhaps the magnitude of the threat. These are not superhumans with unprecedented ability to form states or to seize territory or to inspire. The world's history is full of insurgencies that have captured territory and sought to govern it by extracting resources from the local population. The world's history is full of insurgencies that have used graphic, violent terrorism to intimidate their enemies and to ensure control over their own local populations. We've seen both Islamist and other ideological movements over world history. This is a dangerous and violent organization which must be confronted, but it's important that we place it in proper perspective. I think the most important perspective that we need to keep is to understand the fundamental strategic dilemma that Islamic extremist groups have faced from the beginning, whether it's Islamic Jihad in Egypt, or the armed Islamic group in Algeria, or al-Qaeda in the 2000s, or ISIL today. And that fundamental strategic problem is that while they do absolutely have the vision that General Flynn described, the characteristics that General Flynn described, and that extreme dogmatism, the vast, vast majority of the Muslims of the world do not agree with them, and they have failed every time they have attempted to reach out and to mobilize the world's Muslims on their side. The ideology and the strategy of al-Qaeda and ISIL is to create a clash of civilizations, to create an unbridgeable divide between the Muslims of the world and the West. And what we must keep in mind as we formulate any kind of effective strategy is that the way to defeat ISIL, al-Qaeda, and all forms of violent extremism is to marginalize them and to form alliances with the vast majority of the world who reject their barbarism and who reject their extreme ideologies. The face of Muslims in the minds of Americans and the face of Muslims in the mind of the world should not be Abu Bakr Baghdadi. It should not be Osama bin Laden. It should not be the faceless murderers of the journalists of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. It should be Yusra Abu Saleh, Razan Abu Saleh, Dia Barakat, the Steph Curry-loving dental student and volunteer for Syrian refugees who was murdered in North Carolina this week. To defeat ISIL, America must be seen as their champion, not as their enemy. And if we are able to align ourselves with the aspirations and the hopes of Muslims all over the world, then ISIL can be defeated, and only then. And so I do not disagree with General Flynn's characterization of the threat posed by ISIL, but I believe it's extremely important that we approach this threat from the perspective of the need to constantly seek to deflate their pretensions, to marginalize them, and to expose their extremism in the eyes not only of us, but of the Muslims who they seek to recruit, to mobilize, and ultimately to lead. Now, this was, I believe, one of the great accomplishments, the great bipartisan accomplishments of both the Bush administration after 9/11 and the Obama administration. The immediate understanding of the strategic divide and the need to not allow al-Qaeda after 9/11 to provoke this kind of clash of civilizations. President Bush, despite some missteps early on, I think did a fantastic job of trying to reach out to the Muslims of the United States and to ensure that this divide did not open up. And I think that's a bipartisan commitment that we should build on today. Now, in my prepared statement, I go through in some detail explanations for why ISIL has emerged in the form that it has today. I won't repeat those here. Let me just hit some of the bullet points because I think it's important to place this into a specific political context. Ranking Member Smith, in his opening statement, mentioned the failures of governance, and I think this is extremely important. The failure of the Arab uprisings is a key part of the emergence of ISIL in the form it is today. An enormous number of young Muslims, young Arabs around the Middle East have seen their hopes raised and then crushed. The military coup in Egypt is a particularly defining point in proving, unfortunately, to a large number of people that peaceful political participation is not an option. If we're going to respond to ISIL in the way, as again, I agree with General Flynn that we must, we need to address those underlying causes of despair, of alienation, and the absence of alternative paths, which is building the possible pool of recruits for ISIL. That includes reversing the sectarian misgovernment of Iraq. It includes trying to find some kind of peaceful de-escalation of the war in Syria. And it means trying to find some way to align the United States with the forces of moderate and peaceful change. That's no easy task. I have some ideas about how we might go about doing that, but for now, I'll simply stop, and I welcome everyone's questions.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the testimony from each of you. I'd like to ask, hopefully, just a brief question from each of you. General Flynn, towards the end of your statement, you make a point that an AUMF should not be overly constrained. You've had a lot of experience fighting these folks in the Middle East and South Asia. Do you have an opinion about how difficult it would be for our troops to follow a restriction that said they could not engage in enduring offensive ground combat operations?
Yes. So we need to be very clear in this AUMF that will, may come out of an agreement between the legislative and executive branches here. When we give our military commanders a mission, we should allow them to execute that mission. and not overly constrain them with approved authorities, but then having to come back to the administration for permission. So if we authorize the use of force to do something with these many times fleeting opportunities out there that our military forces see, and then they got to come back up through a bureaucratic process to get permission, even though there's an authority given to them, then either we need to review those authorities and those permissions, or we need to change the commanders because we apparently don't trust them to do the job that we've given them to do. So that's a real problem today. Give the commanders the authority to execute the mission that they've been given. If they're not the right people, remove them and put somebody else in there that can do that. Otherwise, allow them to do the things that they have been assigned, tasked, and are very capable of doing in what is currently the AUMF that we have. We have become so overly bureaucratic in coming up through the system to get permission to basically do things that frankly, colonels on the battlefield or captains at sea are very capable of doing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Braniff, I was struck in your testimony that, as I read it, that just in the last 12 months, we've seen a dramatic rise in these terrorist organizations and in their attacks. Now, as I understand it, one of the things your organization does is keep track of these with objective metrics. And am I reading that right, that even in the last year we've seen this problem get dramatically worse?
Mr. Chairman, if you compare the most violent terrorist organizations in 2013 to those in 2014, the level of violence from ISIL, the Taliban, Shabab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan have increased from between 2013 to 2014, according to preliminary data. Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya have all experienced increases in terrorist violence between 2013 and our preliminary data from 2014. Pakistan is the only sort of affected nation which has seen a decrease out of the countries where Al-Qaeda and its associated movement are active. We've seen a year-on-year increase over the last 12 months and over the 12 months before that and the 12 months before that. So the trend line is continuing to rise. The partial explanation is that a lot of the strategy now focuses on trying to build capabilities of partner nations to deal with this issue, and that's a slow process, and so things may get worse before they get better. That's an opportunistic read of the scenario. A pessimistic read of the scenario is that these organizations have enjoyed greater safe haven in a post-Arab Spring world and have seized on the less stable governments and are exploiting that safe haven.
Okay. So, Dr. Lynch, I'm a little perplexed by a sentence you have in your prepared statement that says the U.S. has thus far crafted an effective strategy in responding to ISIL, which has halted its momentum. Is that the way you see the developments over the last year or so?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I actually think that the way the administration has crafted the strategy as an initial step has been quite effective. They managed to leverage the increased military commitment in Iraq into the most important move, which was a change in the government of Iraq and the removal of Prime Minister Maliki, who, in my opinion, had carried out a campaign of sectarian misgovernment and corruption, which had lost and squandered all of the gains of the previous years by managing to then get a new Iraqi prime minister willing and able to reach out to Iraqi Sunnis and then to use air power and limited military support. The momentum of ISIL has been halted. They're no longer able to advance. They suffered a serious defeat in Kobani, thanks to coalition air power. And they've now seen a significant reversal in the eyes of Arab public opinion after the brutal murder of a Jordanian pilot, Moaz al-Qasasbeh. And so, and momentum matters for them because their appeal was rooted in the idea that they were a winner. And now people aren't so sure. And I think we might actually see people jumping off the bandwagon faster than we think.
I appreciate it. Obviously, I hope the optimistic scenarios prove right. I worry that we see momentum through our eyes, not necessarily through their eyes. But at this time, I'd yield to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just following up on that rather key point, there's problems all over the world. Yemen, ironically, is a Shiite uprising that has, overturned the government there, which gets us into the whole issue that if, decent governance in that region is going to depend upon, believe it or not, Saudi Arabia and Iran figuring out how to get along in that part of the world, because neither one is going to be able to vanquish the other, and in the meantime, they're doing enormous damage to each other. But that's subject perhaps for a whole other hearing. But this notion that it's all falling apart. These guys are, as you said, Dr. Lynch, Superman. They're going to take over everything. And I think the analysis of ISIL is interesting. You watch the news reports and the chairman's comments about how they're still spreading, they're still growing. That's what people believe. That's simply not the case. Several months ago, and I'm going to get my timeline wrong, when they went rolling through, out of Syria, went rolling through Iraq, took Mosul, everyone was saying, oh my goodness, they're going to be in Baghdad next week. Well, they're not, and they're never going to be. They were, as you mentioned, rolled out of Kobani. They have not taken any territory since that initial surge, and they have given back territory. They were also within miles of Erbil, and again, my timeline is off here, but a few months before, but with Allied support and with support for the Kurds, they were pushed back. So we have to keep this in a realistic perspective, because I think our greatest strength and possibility here is what you said. These guys can't govern. They cannot deliver for the Muslim population. And in Mosul right now, it's fallen apart. The electricity is off pretty much every day. Nobody's picking up the garbage. They can't govern. The people there are only staying with them out of fear. So I do believe that ISIL's momentum has been blunted, and it's really interesting. It's been blunted in part with the help of the U.S. military, but it's been blunted more by their own weaknesses. And that's what we have to remember, and that's what I want to ask General Flynn about. I get this. It is an existential threat. I agree with you. And therefore we have to, amass all of our forces and figure out how to defeat them. But fundamentally, do you disagree with the statement that U.S. military might is simply not in a position to defeat this ideology because of this clash of civilizations, because of the way the Muslim world looks at Western aggression, and that the only way that we're going to be successful is if we get moderate Muslims to rise up against these folks and support them? Or do you think it would be good to drop a whole bunch of troops down in the middle of Syria and Iraq right now and go get them? Or don't you see sort of how that would perhaps play into the hands of ISIL? And if so, what does it mean to say we're going to mount all of our military might and go get them? Don't we have a little bit of a Gordian knot in that regard?
So the quick answer is...
Sorry, that was like 6 questions.
Yeah, I know. It's good.
It's early in the morning.
You typically do that to me.
Yeah.
Overall, the answer is yes.
Yes, you believe you...
Yes, that I don't believe what you just said about, dropping in, hundreds of thousands or U.S. forces. You also said that they are an existential threat. I wouldn't sit here today and say ISIS is an existential threat to this country.
The broader ideology.
But the broader ideology is one that will get inside of our bloodstream, get inside of our DNA, if you will, and will permeate over time if we don't do something about it now. So it doesn't help us to just kind of wait to do something. Now, when I describe, in what I recommended about, the combination of the elements of national power, you just look at the information campaign that is being waged not by just ISIS, but by al-Qaeda writ large, and the way that they're able to do it, the sophistication that they're able to do it. That campaign alone, the military has some little bits and pieces of trying to counter that on a tactical battlefield, but there has to be a broader imagination that this country, working with partners and working with some of these, these so-called moderate nations, and I say that in my statement about we have partners out there, and we got to really be honest with ourselves about some of these partners. We can't continue to fund and do all these kinds of things and have some of these nations sit at the table with the United States of America when in fact we know that they're funding some of these organizations. That's a diplomatic tool that we have to leverage. There are economic tools that we have to leverage. When we say that we're going after terrorist financing and we're going to stop this guy, we're going to shut down this money being made by the Baji oil refinery. Those are tactical things. We have to look at how are we dealing with the moderate, frankly, the moderate Arab world and these nations where we do have economic partnerships and relationships, and we need to ask them, are they doing everything they can from the role of being moderate?
Let me clarify, and I think Dr. Lynch would agree. I'm not going to say that there's a moderate, Muslim nation. We're talking about more individual people and groups than we are one nation or another. And, for instance, I mean, the biggest success that we had in Iraq was the Anbar Awakening. And that wasn't a government. That was Sunni tribes rising up and saying, and you were there, a hell of a lot more.
Well, I agree. I mean, it took 50,000 more troops, though, too. The Anbar Awakening was incentivized by another 50,000 U.S. American troops on the ground.
That's a fascinating argument because, the Anbar Awakening was a force multiplier of like 2 million.
But I mean, I talk to some of these individuals almost on a daily basis who are involved in this. So I guess what I'm telling you, Congressman, is that we have to be far more sophisticated, and we really do have to use our imagination to defeat this ideology. Tactically, we need to go after ISIS, and then, frankly, any of these other safe havens. But we have to be more sophisticated in our application of all the instruments of national power to be able to achieve what it is that I believe we need to achieve over a long period of time, as you recognize in your opening statement.
And I won't disagree with that. The only thing I will say is I worry a great deal about the notion that people are focused on the U.S. military as the solution to this problem. And I worry when we talk about, the AUMF has to be open-ended so we can go anywhere, anytime. And believe me, I love the military. You work with them, you ask them if they can do something. Is the answer ever no?
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, you tell them, you got 5 guys, can you defeat these things? Yeah, I mean, that's just how they're oriented, and that's terrific. But that isn't always the right strategy. Because sometimes there are things that military might can't do, and in this case, can really sort of turn it back around on us if we aren't careful.
But there is, and I'm sorry because I don't want to go into too much of this, but there is a benefit to applying pressure on an enemy.
Absolutely.
I mean, you have to not let them have a sound night's sleep anywhere where these vicious individuals exist and groups exist. And in the meantime, all the other pieces that we have to bring to bear, and that's really my argument. And that's one administration to the next, because I think the last administration really struggled and maybe came to that realization later on.
It's not an easy answer.
It's not.
I mean,
it's not an easy answer.
To know when to apply force and when not to. And it is, there's a lot more tactics than strategy. You've been generous with the time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Flynn, in 2002, the authorization for use of military force basically said the President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate. Why do you think we now have an AUMF before us that puts restrictions on it, on things that the President claims he can do without an AUMF?
I guess my answer to that would be whatever the decision is between this body and the executive branch of government, we have to make sure, in one sense, we have to play our cards very close to our chest, meaning don't discount any option that the United States of America has by telegraphing what those options are or not going to be. We're not going to commit troops, or we're not going to do this or that. So I just think that we have to play a very smart card game with the AUMF. I think on this AUMF thing, though, is that, like I said, that's not a comprehensive strategy. That is a component of something that we need. And like I said to the chairman, we have to make sure that we, when we lay this out to our military forces primarily, and to a degree some inside of our intelligence community, that they have the full authority to be able to execute the tasks that they're going to be assigned. Otherwise, you're tying our hands behind our back, so to speak, and we're slowing the system down through unnecessary bureaucracy.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch. Do you really think that a group of barbarian thugs who would make a fellow human being kneel down before them and cut their heads off really care if they're marginalized? Or do you care, do you really think that a group of barbarian thugs who would put a fellow Muslim in a cage, douse him with gas, set him on fire, and watch him burn to death really care if they're marginalized? And if you think that, how long do you think it will take for this marginalization to take place?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a great question and a really important one. I don't think they care, but the nature of their not caring is extremely important. So basically, when you're a group like Al-Qaeda or a group like ISIL, you have two basic strategies you can pursue, same as an election here, right? You can play to your base, or you can try and reach out to the median voter. And what you're seeing with ISIL is very much a base strategy, right? They have decided that, that they want to mobilize the already radicalized, the most dangerous people, the disenfranchised, the ones who are already radicalized, and they want to get them out to Syria and Iraq and to join. And so what we're seeing is that at least by press accounts, and open source accounts, the flow of foreign fighters is increasing. In other words, those brutal videos are actually inspiring that very small number of people and getting them to leave Cairo, to leave Tunis, and come out to ISIL. But at the same time, they're alienating the broader mainstream public. And so the way I would reframe your question is this drying up their pool of recruits faster than they can get them and extract them and bring them into their fight? And I think that the answer to that is still unclear, and that's why I'm advocating a strategy in which we try and accelerate their marginalization and alienation from that broader pool of potential recruits. And so, no, I don't think they care in the slightest. Many of you remember the old battles between Zarqawi and Zawahiri about the strategy of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Zarqawi's response to criticism that he was alienating Muslims by butchering Shiites was saying, I don't care, I'm closer to God than you are, right? I don't care about the mainstream Muslim who has already abandoned God. He chose a base strategy, whereas, which is what ISIL has done as well. And so we need to recognize that and then try and make them pay the cost for that base strategy.
And that cost is?
That cost is to continue to, and I think we've already started this, and I think our Arab allies have done this, is a really strong strategic communications campaigns to highlight their barbarity, to highlight their extremism, to deflate their pretensions to power, to expose the realities of life in ISIL-governed territories, and to puncture their mystique in such a way that the alienated, disenfranchised youth in Tunis or in Libya doesn't see it as an attractive, noble, or heroic thing to go and join this group. And I think that that's the way we need to approach them, to undermine them and deflate them rather than to exaggerate their capabilities.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Flynn, thank you for your testimony, for your service. I think you made a number of excellent points, including the need to have a clear and comprehensive strategy from the administration before we move forward with an authorization for the use of military force. You also talked about our need to rethink our relationships with our regional allies, and I think you said something to the effect, if they fail to adhere to global standards and norms and values in international law, then we need to rethink our ties, and I think you may have even said cut off those ties. When I think about our allies there, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, the prior leadership in Yemen, al-Maliki prior in Iraq, Sisi. These are governments that in many cases are amongst the most corrupt or venal or repressive in the world, and yet they are our allies in this fight. How do we pursue a strategy in that region and be consistent to the advice that you gave us, which I think is really good advice? And I think those repressive regimes and our relationships with them complicate our ability to be effective in the Middle East.
Yeah, and so thanks very much for asking that question. This is the essence of the problem. This is not a military phenomenon that we are facing. Back to the ranking member's, missive about what he was talking about with military and boots on the ground, and everybody's sort of throws that phrase around. We need to stop using that, by the way. We need to really understand what does that mean. This is a social, a cultural, and a psychological phenomenon, particularly in the Arab world, and the potential breakdown of sort of Arab world order over time if we do not change this mindset and really move some of these countries to change their internal behavior. What we saw in Egypt as an example of essentially 3 regimes. Now President al-Sisi in there, and what President al-Sisi is trying to do is he's just trying to bring a sense of security and stability before they can even think about returning to any kind of form of prosperity. I think a country like Jordan, the king there and how they treat their population and how they are being, really exceptional, moderate example within this very, very difficult part of the world that we're in. There are other templates, if you will, out there. But the underlying conditions that I think everybody recognizes, all of us recognize, if those underlying conditions don't change, then what is going to happen is this problem is going to continue to grow, and it's going to undermine the stability of these countries to the point where they're going to lose. They're eventually going to lose. And it's not just Iraq and Syria and what we're seeing there. I mean, we're already talking about, a lot of other places around the trans-region area that are at risk. I mean, what just happened with this Houthi separatist movement down in Yemen? This movement's been going on for a long, long time, and then of course you got Al Qaeda that took over this military base. I mean, Libya, those 2 states right now, and we should look at ourselves. Those 2 states right now are failing or failed states, or will become that way, because who will recognize Yemen? Will it be us, or is it going to be Iran? Because Iran fully backs that Houthi separatist movement that just took over Yemen, and that was a country that we were trying to defeat this threat, this Sunni version of radical Islam. So I mean, this is that's the essence of the problem, and we have to look at how do we want to act. When somebody sits at the table of the United States of America, they better be sitting there fully recognizing international law and at least having a recognition of internationally accepted norms and behaviors. If they don't, we're being hypocritical.
And I wonder if we have the will to act on that and to really deliver some consequences, withdrawing military aid, isolating those countries, rethinking our relationships. And in the past, we have proven unable to do that or unwilling for probably important tactical or strategic reasons. And I think we'll really be tested right now. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just real quickly, we're not chained by oil to the United States is no longer chained to the Middle East for oil. That's a big deal. So sorry. Sorry, Chairman.
Appreciate it. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Flynn, I've got a question for you. I'm really concerned that just this week, President Barack Obama was interviewed and compared fighting ISIS to a big city mayor fighting crime. And that really troubles me because there's no comparison. That is a horrible and poor analogy. In a big city, if you have criminals like muggers, carjackers, drug dealers, they're not trying to kill the mayor and take over the city government, which is what ISIS is trying to do in the various countries in the Middle East. And they want to take over and destabilize Jordan and Saudi Arabia, ultimately go after Israel. There's just no comparison to a big city mayor fighting crime. Are you troubled by that type of analogy, and does that indicate to you, like it does to me, that he just doesn't get it?
Well, what I have said is that you cannot defeat an enemy that you do not admit exists. And I really, really strongly believe that the American public needs and wants moral, intellectual, and really strategic clarity and courage on this threat. I mean, there is no comparison. And it's not to take away the danger that exists with the thugs and the criminals that are in our own system, but that's not what it is that we are facing in this discussion that we're having right now. It's totally different.
Also, let me change subjects and ask about Guantanamo Bay. And there was an interesting exchange over in the Senate the other day, and my friend and colleague, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, was talking to an administration official and making the point that the fight was brought to our homeland before Guantanamo Bay ever existed, and even if the president succeeds in shutting it down, the fight will continue against us. So, do you agree with me that it's important to have a place where we can detain the worst of the worst, which takes them out of the fight, until such time as maybe they go before a military tribunal or in some way face justice, and that outweighs whatever propaganda effect the bad guys have, who will find something to fight, to criticize us for if they don't have that?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. A couple of things. There are three ways to deal with a terrorist. You kill them, you capture them, or you turn them. And you work with these partner nations around the world. And the Saudis actually had a pretty effective program for a few years back where they were turning them, dealing with their families and things like that. But those are the three ways to deal with a terrorist. We say, and this gets back to the question on the AUMF, because right now we're not capturing anybody. I mean, we might go out and detain somebody, and and it's work between the military and the FBI like we did with this guy in Libya. But there's a lot of others out there that we probably would benefit from capturing. I mean, we used to say when I was in the special operations community that had we not had the ability to professionally interrogate those that we capture, the high-value targets or the mid-value targets, we might as well take that Cadillac and bring it on home and park it in the garage. Because the capturing of individuals in this environment is actually it's the best form of intelligence that you can get, period, bar none. I've lived it. I've run those facilities, and we know how to do them very professionally because we learned a really ugly lesson over 10 years ago now. So you have to be able to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Cooper, he's not here. I'm sorry. Yeah, Ms. Graham.
First, thank you very much for being here this morning. You've touched a bit on other terrorist groups in the region. Could you please provide an update on Hezbollah? Thank you.
I'll give it a shot, and you guys can talk. I mean, so Hezbollah is an Iranian-backed group. They are, I believe, we are still designating them as a terrorist organization, our State Department. Hezbollah is deeply involved in Syria. So they are fighting in Syria. Members of Hezbollah are fighting, and they're actually leading and doing some of the sort of what I would call, sort of special operations type training of some of the Syrian forces. Hezbollah is involved in Yemen. Hezbollah is certainly involved in Lebanon and some of the disruption of things in that particular country. And Hezbollah is involved in Iraq as well. So members of Hezbollah are in fact inside of Iraq fighting with what I would describe as what we used to call the Badr Corps organization, which we know is led by members of Iran's IRGC. So Hezbollah is a very dangerous organization. They are responsible for killing many, many Americans. And we need to not let them sort of get a pass on any of this.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let me just say very quickly that Hezbollah actually has been in a very difficult position for the last several years because of its role in Syria, which has been quite controversial. It's exposed now in ways that it never was before. It enjoyed in the past a very solid, basically impregnable base in the south of Lebanon and the Shia community of Lebanon, and from there it was able to play a dominant role in not just Shia politics in Lebanon, but in the overall Lebanese political system. Now Lebanon is a state that is hanging on by its fingernails. More than 1 million Syrian refugees, growing signs of sectarian conflict and violence, and even there's increasing signs of grumblings among the Shia middle-class community itself, saying, what happened to protecting our interests? Why are our boys going out and dying in Syria? But also at the same time, radicalization of those Shia communities, saying, why aren't you fighting Israel? Why aren't you doing more? So the leadership of Hezbollah is clearly, yes, it's clearly a dangerous and extremely capable and robust organization, but this is probably the most difficult political situation it's faced in many, many years. It no longer can claim to speak for a broad resistance to Israel. Nobody believes that anymore because they've seen, no Sunnis believe that, because they've seen Hezbollah men out there killing and murdering Sunni civilians. So they've lost that card, and they're much weaker because the Lebanese state is much weaker. So it's a very difficult time for them, and they're having, I would say, a very difficult time navigating this new situation.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The only thing I would add is that I mentioned the word sectarianism numerous times in my oral testimony. I find this to be a very important issue, that we have to understand that one of the ways that extremist ideologies can become more mainstream is when societies are polarized and people feel like they have to pick a side, that they have no choice but to pick a side, and the only candidates for their vote, so to speak, are extremist organizations in this very polarized environment. So I worry about the sectarian violence in Syria being exported to other neighboring countries and creating a wider sectarian conflict. Hezbollah is one of the organizations that could be a conduit for that spread of sectarian violence, and Lebanon, as a country with a very interesting sort of denominational system of representation, is really the kind of country that would be vulnerable to sectarian violence going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate the update.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your testimony. General Flynn, how worried are you about American citizens becoming radicalized, training overseas, and returning back to the United States? And are there additional steps that the U.S. should take in addressing those citizens that travel to train with ISIS in Syria, in Iraq, and then later to the United States, and the threats that they would pose here? I'd like to get your perspective.
Yeah, first, I think that our FBI and the leadership of the FBI is doing a phenomenal job dealing with this issue here in the homeland. Just to give you a little perspective of when somebody shows up to Syria, okay, and this has been going on for a while, they do a little vetting of who these individuals are. And if it's somebody who just came over to, to sort of get their jihad on, so to speak, they may just tell them, you're going to be a suicide bomber, here's what we're going to do, here's where you're going to operate, and go forth and do good. In the other parts of the vetting, though, they look for individuals who have different skill sets, who have savvy with the internet, who have some leadership skills, who maybe have some engineering capabilities. So they're sophisticated in how they recruit, particularly when they arrive. And those individuals then get put into a different pipeline. They may not get put into the suicide attacker or VBIED pipeline. They may get put into a different pipeline. And those are the individuals that there will be sort of a different future for them to maybe come back to this country and get involved in additional recruiting, additional activities, and maybe larger scale types of attacks that we're trying to avoid. So I just think that a variety of reasons why they get recruited. The internet is a big, big part of this. I think our FBI is doing the best job that they can, but we really need to recognize and track who these persons are. And to be honest with you, if somebody is going to conspire to fight against us, which is essentially what they're doing, there also has to be a discussion, at least, about their citizenship.
So you think then the additional steps is to look very carefully at those people that travel. Of course, my concern, too, is that Turkey is a conduit for people traveling into Syria and those areas. So are there additional steps we should take in working with Turkey to be more aggressive with them, looking specifically at those folks that have left the country, but some kind of provision on their return, about the conditions on their return back to the United States? Give me your perspective.
Yeah, so the combination of intelligence and law enforcement is a big deal. It gets right at what you're talking about. So we have to make sure that there are good mechanisms in place, processes in place to rapidly share intelligence, rapidly share law enforcement, sensitive law enforcement information, and we need to be able to do it with a variety of partners. Turkey being probably one of the principal ones right now, because if we know somebody is getting on a plane out of LaGuardia or Dulles to fly over to Ankara, then we need to make sure that we recognize who they are and they're being tracked, they have the right visas, and then, you know, Turkey needs to know what they're doing over there. I mean, this is one of these difficult things because we're trying to also protect our own freedom to travel and all that sort of business. But we've got to know, why are you going there? Are you part of a non-governmental organization? Are you part of a private organization that's going to provide humanitarian assistance? Or are you going over there for some other ill-gotten gain?
Gotcha. Let me ask this. We've seen what's happening in Yemen. It's collapsing before our eyes. Our U.S. Marines, our embassy staff, the embassy now is abandoned. We see the chaos that's going on there. We see Iranian influence there in that particular region. It was not long ago pointed to that this is one of our foreign policy successes in how we dealt with terrorism, that we were in support of the government there, that our counterterrorism efforts were successful. A couple questions. What went wrong? And is this an indicator of a broader weakness or failure of U.S. foreign policy?
From my perspective, the last decade plus of war, if I had to give you one lesson learned, that lesson learned would be that we failed and we continue to fail to understand the threats that we face, and that failure is leading to a mismatch in strategy and resources that we are applying against these threats. And therefore, that failure is leading to these types of, you know, things that we're seeing in Yemen and in other parts of the greater Arab world. And I think the second, third, fourth order effects of Libya, I'm really concerned about post a period of time in Afghanistan based on what we've already heard we're going to do. And I noticed in the Washington Post today there's an article there about, you know, we're rethinking our timeline for departure from Afghanistan. I think that's appropriate. So that failure led to a mismatch in resources and strategy as to how we applied it against this enemy.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and for your presentations. General Flynn, could you follow up a bit on your comment just now, because you're talking about the lessons learned about the mismatch and the threats, and would you make that same analysis about even our not understanding the countries, Iraq, for example, when we went into Iraq and may have created more enemies than friends? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's very, you know, I mean, what you're implying is very true. And I think that we, you know, in the spectrum of conflict, when we define the spectrum of conflict, we in the military look at it from peace to war. The political dimension of our country has to look at it from peace and get us back to peace in order to get us out of war. And we don't do a really good job thinking past the point of conflict or the point of war. And we have to do that. And I think that's part of this debate, as the ranking member was highlighting, that we have to not just throw military resources at this thing. We have to be far more sophisticated. But that's not comprehensive right now. That sophistication, I don't see it. And I've been studying this problem for a long time, and I'm hopeful that we can get our act together. But it has to be one that's very, very comprehensive and it's going to be a multi-generational problem. And there are moderates out there that we do need to encourage. Somebody sent me a note the other day and said, hey, there's 126 subject matter experts, clerics and others in the Muslim world that came out strong against ISIS. Why aren't there 126,000? Why are there only 126? I mean, there's that many mosques in Baghdad. I mean, there should be thousands, and there should be leaders of these countries that we are dealing with that need to stand up and make a statement, make a strong statement about what it is that we're doing or not doing. So, yeah.
Thank you. If right now, I think there are perhaps some opportunities that we're not using. I'm thinking of the Peshmerga in Kurdistan. Have you had any thoughts about that, of why we're not utilizing and doing as good a job as we can in really facilitating greater involvement on their behalf? They're asking for it. We're not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question to ask, especially from this committee. So yeah, we could do more, and we could give them more support. We could help in training them and getting them more sophisticated and really putting in the right kinds of military tools. But that's, again, we need to be careful that we don't always get drawn back into what is actually the easiest part of a strategy, which is to throw a military force at it.
I can't agree with you more on that.
I mean, so we just have to be more sophisticated.
Yeah, if I could go on.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just shifting to another region, the Boko Haram. Before a Senate Intelligence Committee meeting yesterday, the growing connections between ISIS and the Boko Haram was mentioned. I don't know whether you happen to hear that discussion, but where, even in terms of the AUMF, are we thinking about that connection and the I guess, horrible potential that would bring as well?
Yeah, and I'll let Bill answer this too, because I think he mentioned Boko Haram in his statement. And number one, Boko Haram is incredibly vicious. I mean, my God, look at what they've done with children, young women. I mean, these are children. And I can't put that aside, but now, so the connection between these organizations is very real. And we know that Al-Qaeda, so the Al-Qaeda command and control, Al-Qaeda senior leaders were in fact dealing with Boko Haram, in a sort of a cursory way when bin Laden was still alive. Okay, so this is not some connection that just all of a sudden happened and Boko Haram has just popped up. And hopefully you've seen General Rodriguez, our commander of AFRICOM, recently talking about we need a full sort of counterinsurgency effort. And again, I think there's 7 or 8 nations in Africa that are trying to come to grips with dealing with Boko Haram now. They just postponed their elections. I mean, this is a long-term problem, and these groups are in fact connected.
Thank you. I think my time is up, and perhaps Dr. Lynch can bring this up later.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about ISIS. I served in Iraq with the Marine Corps in 2005, in Ramadi and Fallujah in 2006, in Haditha, Bawana, Haklaniya, in the western Euphrates River Valley. And what I found in the Sunni Arab population is they clearly didn't like us. We upset the apple cart. They saw the government in Baghdad as a Shia-dominated government, sectarian government that was against them, and they were against the government. But when they saw later on a path, the fissures between the Al-Qaeda element and the local insurgents became more significant over time. And I think when they saw a path where they could be a part of the government, then those fissures, exploded between the two. And I found them to be a very moderate people. Boys and girls went to school together in these towns, secular curriculum, annual exams, and very dependent upon a lot of government services. And so it's hard for me to envision them subjugated to this this radical Islamic group, ISIS. They were temporarily aligned with Al Qaeda, and when then they broke up. And so, what's the prognosis here? And I'll refer to each one of you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think you're absolutely right about that and about the nature of the Iraqi Sunni community and the resentment, both of us and especially of the Shia-dominated government. And I think one of the great strategic missed opportunities that we've had in the Middle East was that Nouri al-Maliki was unable to capitalize on that and to rebuild connections with the Sunni community. Instead, he decided to rule in the sectarian way, going after Sunni leaders, not getting the Awakenings forces into the security forces. It was a tragic missed opportunity. I think that you're also absolutely right about the long-term implausibility of people like this being willing to live under ISIL. The problem right now, though, I think, is that the sectarianism has become so intense and so deeply ingrained. You're talking about populations with enormous levels of displacement, both internal and refugees, people who've seen family members being butchered on sectarian grounds, and an enormous amount of mistrust of state institutions like the Ministry of the Interior and the Iraqi security forces, which makes it very difficult for them to look at the Iraqi government as a partner. And I think that until they're able to look at the Iraqi government and see it as a viable partner, then it's going to be difficult for them to make that leap that they made back in 2006, 2007. That's why I think getting a new prime minister in place and trying to begin some serious security service reforms and institutional reforms is what you need to do in order to win in Iraq. And reversing that sectarianism is going to be extraordinarily difficult at this point, but we have to begin taking those steps. I think the National Guard project that they've begun to work on, I think, is absolutely the right way to do it. Something which is institutionalized and can't simply be dissolved at the stroke of a pen, the way that the promises to incorporate the Awakenings were done back in 08, 09.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. I would just reiterate, START researcher Mansour Muadil has done extensive surveys in the Muslim world, and the Iraqi population is overwhelmingly secular in how they responded to national level polls even within the last 2 years. And to me, if sectarianism trumps secularism the way it has in Iraq, because of this sort of identity politics that are being leveraged by groups like ISIL, then we better make sure that our national strategy to address violent extremism in other places really pushes back on sectarianism, because it's such a powerful force. It's a force of nature. And if we don't deal with sectarianism, right, ISIL and AQAM and these groups have a relatively easy time forcing people to pick a side through violence.
General Flynn.
Yeah, really briefly. A lot of lessons learned between the way Zarqawi operated and the way al-Baghdadi is operating, and that has been a discussion within the ranks of the al-Qaeda movement. Okay, so they learned lessons from the way Zarqawi did things, and al-Baghdadi is avoiding many of those mistakes. And then really three things: incredible levels of corruption. This is within the governments, okay, in this case Iraq. Lack of inclusiveness, which is very real, and even though the new president that's in there now still, there's not a sense of that by the people in there, and just the real desperate economic conditions that these people live within, and that's going to be a difficult thing to change, but it could change because these countries actually have the wealth to provide for their citizens.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Each of you has made points throughout this morning about how this sectarianism is a driver for violence, how the trust of the Sunni tribes and people must be earned in order to take the oxygen away that currently exists, especially in Iraq for ISIS. How can this be done with this current strategy? You've talked about new leadership in place. You've talked about different rhetoric, a different way of doing things, but the fact and the reality is that Iran's influence over this current government in Iraq continues as it has been. Their ability to have any sense of control over the Shia militias and who they're attacking and what they're doing does not exist. And unless you go to a different model of governance and go away from this attachment to this continued policy of one central government in Iraq and move to something where you're actually truly empowering the Kurds, where you're not having to funnel everything through the Baghdad government, where at this point even a small margin of the weapons and ammunition that we're sending is getting to them, and empower the Sunnis and empower the Shias in some type of three-state solution. How is this current strategy a winning strategy to defeat ISIS unless you get to the core of this issue?
I'll just quickly. I believe that we are going to not go back to the way things were. The breakdown of the boundaries within this region are going to be incredibly difficult to get back to. Not impossible, but I just don't see that happening anytime soon, potentially in my lifetime. I would say that Iran is the greater problem. They do not see inclusiveness of Sunnis, from the Iranian viewpoint, and I think that they, like you saw in Yemen recently, with some of the chanting that we saw, you are seeing in Iraq things occur that are clearly Iranian influenced and against everything that we are trying to do. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for the question. The problem with Iraq, I mean, you're absolutely right about the role of Iran and Iraq. It's pervasive, and it goes beyond the Shiite militias. It's at every level of the government, every level of the state, the security forces, the Kurds. I mean, they have relations with everybody in Iraq because they actually have a full spectrum strategy for dealing with a close neighbor. I would actually not pose Iran as the primary problem in Iraq. I think the militias are a primary problem, and Iran can use that instrument when it is useful for them, and if they decide that it's not useful for them, then they can begin to move to try and shut it down. And I think that the key point is going to be that it's impossible to have, as you said, it's impossible to have a strategy which is about keeping a unified state in Iraq that isn't going to include some kind of tacit or formal, maybe not formal, but at least tacit cooperation with Iran. Their role in Iraq is simply too pervasive and too real. The security forces can't be disaggregated and only working with Sunni units. And if you want to tamp down sectarianism, you can't then double down on a Sunni-Shia division of Iraq and try and only work with the Sunnis and fight against the Shiites. What you need to do is to try and bring that country back together, tamp down the sectarianism, and have a state based on citizenship. There's already been huge progress on decentralization, the Constitution. They're dealing with these issues of oil revenues and all these things, and no one's very happy with any of the solutions that they've come up with, but they're working on them. I think that the idea of allowing the Kurds to go their own way, I think at this time is not a good one. I think that certainly we should continue to support the Pesh. We should continue to advocate Kurdish self-interest, but I think the Kurdish interests still are to be part of an Iraq in this decentralized federal framework, and that's why I still think it is a good idea to funnel support, military support and other things through Baghdad. In other words, give them what they need, help them in the ways they need to be helped, but don't encourage the fragmentation of the state. And the key problem there, and I'll finish, is that you talk about a three-state solution, and we've heard about this quite a lot. There's a fairly plausible Shiite sub-state that you could imagine, and there's a very plausible Kurdish one. There's no plausible Sunni third state other than the one ISIL has carved out, and that I think is not in an American interest to create. You need to keep the Sunni parts and the Shia parts together in something that we're calling Iraq, and so you're going to need to find some kind of bargain by which that state can coexist and can survive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. The President recently released his 2015 National Security Strategy, and on the White House website it states that the strategy is the blueprint for America's leadership in the world, how we address global challenges while advancing our nation's interests, values, and vision for the future. On page 3 of the strategy, it says, we are leading a global campaign in degrading and ultimately defeating the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And on page 15, it states, we reject the lie that America and its allies are at war with Islam. I would disagree with the first statement. I don't think we're leading in trying to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL. But I would agree with the second statement, that we are not at war with all of Islam. We are at war with radical Islam and Islamic extremism, yet nowhere in the strategy does that term appear. In fact, the only two times that the word Islam appears in the strategy are in the two instances I just mentioned. Yet climate change appears 19 times. I would ask, do you think the national security strategy has enough specificity to adequately inform the nested documents of the national defense strategy and the national military strategy to actually have a positive impact on executing a strategy for degrading and ultimately defeating ISIL? And secondly, Dr. Lynch, I would ask, in your statement about the momentum of ISIL being halted, just within the last 24 hours, they've taken control of the city of al-Baghdadi, and they're knocking on the door of the al-Assad air base, where we have 320 Marines in a training capacity. How can you say that the momentum has actually been halted?
In any civil war, thank you. Those are excellent questions, and I really appreciate your opening comment about validating the idea that we're not at war with Islam. It's extremely important. There's been a huge debate about whether we should use the term Islamic extremism or violent Islam or extremist Islam or those sorts of things. I actually fall in the school thing. I don't think it really matters all that much what we call them. I think that this is something that we concern ourselves with greatly, but whether we call them ISIL or Daesh or ISIS or Al-Qaeda, I don't think it matters very much. And I think that this notion that would be interesting to talk about a bit more, but I think that forming a strategy is not dependent. I think it's semantics there. I really believe that. In terms of momentum, I mean, I think that if you look at these kinds of civil wars, there's constantly going to be a surge and a flow, and you're going to see movement here and a decline here and a retreat there. We've been seeing this in Syria now for the last 2.5, 3 years. It's basically been a strategic stalemate, and this village gets captured, this village gets lost. I think you can't read too much into the daily pushes and flows. I think the defeat in Kobani was big because this showed that they were not unstoppable. They put a lot of resources and propaganda efforts into this, and they failed. And that was big for blocking their momentum. I think that we've seen them pulling back from Aleppo. We've seen them trying to concentrate some of their forces. We've seen their failure to move into Erbil and into Baghdad. And so I wouldn't say, and here I would agree with you, there's no sign that we've reversed we're pushing them back, but we stopped their forward momentum and broke the patina of invincibility, which was extremely important, I think, for this bandwagoning effect. Once they don't look invulnerable, that's when those tribes and other factions will start believing that it's safe to flip sides again. And so I think that's how I would describe what is still obviously a very fluid situation.
Yeah, so the national security strategy lays out the world, which is a very complex array of threats. I don't believe that the national security strategy prioritizes what the United States should do about those threats, prioritizing sort of the here and now, and then sort of what a Harry Truman said post-World War II, which was, and I'll quote him, he rightly understood that the Soviets were, quote, animated by a new fanatic faith, unquote. So we have to prioritize, you have to take this strategy, the national security strategy, and prioritize inside of it against the threats that we're facing. The fact that we even use ISIL and the word Islamic in the framework of Islamic State, it actually recognizes that, in fact, in that document, in the President's letter on top of that document, he uses Islamic State in the Levant. So we, the United States, are recognizing the fact that there's somebody called Islamic and there's somebody called a state inside of the Levant. So again, we're struggling to define it as clearly as we possibly can. And it is a radical version of Islam. There's no doubt about it. And we can't not allow ourselves to define something that actually they're calling themselves in a sense. And so if the enemy's calling themselves that, why do we have such a difficult time? And the other thing, just as a real small, minor thing, but the word or the acronym Daesh, okay, that we throw around now, that actually recognizes the latter part of that acronym talks about, it describes Al-Sham. Al-Sham is the Levant. So it actually, to me, in my framework of really trying to understand who it is that we're facing, and I've studied these guys, I've dealt with them, I've talked to them, that actually benefits them. So in a way, we're using an acronym to describe this enemy, and I think it's because the Iraqis asked us to use it, but the acronym actually describes al-Sham, which says you basically are controlling the Levant, which is essentially what they want to do. So we have to be very, very careful about the words that we use. When we use words like mushadin or jihad, those are recognitions of their courage, instead of using a word like musfidun, which means that's about as ugly a word as you can call an Arab. We don't use it. We should.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Just two follow-ups. One on the notion that al-Baghdadi and ISIS is somehow doing better than al-Qaeda did in governance. There have been just as many stories out there. Like I said, Mosul is a disaster, and if I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But from a governance standpoint, and there have been just as many stories of ISIL, cutting people's hands off for smoking and alienating tribes. I don't really see any evidence that they're doing any better in terms of governing Muslims. The one thing that they have going for them is the Baghdad government. Sunnis have no place else to go because, frankly, I haven't seen much improvement with al-Badi. Maliki was terrible, but the Sunnis still look at the Baghdad government as, Shiite and basically sectarian. We've had, massacres of Sunnis by Shia militia groups here recently. I mean, I think that has more to do with the fact that Sunnis are unwilling to break away from al-Baghdadi and ISIL than it does that they're governing better. Am I missing something? Is there some evidence that they are governing better, that they're not doing the same sort of violence against their citizens that al-Qaeda in Iraq did before, or the Taliban did for that matter?
Ranking Member Smith, if I may, thank you for the question. I think the biggest difference is that they are governing. Even if they're governing poorly, most of the al-Qaeda and its associated movement have never really tried to establish formal governance.
That's a separate point. We're talking a little bit about what al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq did control territory before the Anbar awakening, and they did run shadow governments. They did that. The Taliban did as well. So where they have governed was the comparison. And in that sense, are they doing better than the Taliban did or some of these other al-Qaeda and Iraq folks did?
Perhaps one metric would be the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq and Syria. Something about the way they are portraying their governance of Iraq and Syria is inspiring the largest number of foreign fighters to flow into the region. I think it's because they are, quote unquote, living up to the righteous values that they espouse. They're not compromising. They're seen as uncompromising. They're purifying Islam, these kinds of macho terms. And while it's horrific stuff for the base, as Dr. Lynch mentioned, it's a rallying call. And that they're calling Muslims to build the institutions of the caliphate, to take part in this project of reestablishing a religious political empire. And that's empowering, even if the means by which they're governing is appalling. And it's seen as, for some, a more appealing alternative than, like as you mentioned, the Maliki government in Baghdad.
Yeah, not much alternative. And one final point on Guantanamo, the conversation back and forth about that. I would not take seriously any argument that says that we don't need to detain enemies. We do. The question is, do we need to detain them at Guantanamo? Nor would I argue with the point that, look, you're not going to close Guantanamo and have, the violent Islamic extremists go, okay, we're good. I understand that. But it is not necessary, is it, to detain them at Guantanamo? I mean, the entire reason that Guantanamo was set up was the belief that maybe we could somehow sidestep habeas corpus, but the Supreme Court has shut that down. Is there any reason that we couldn't take these people, as we have in many instances, and detain them here in the United States?
So we definitely need to be able to capture, because if we only kill, that to me is a moral problem.
Got that, but where?
So when you look at prior to 2003, there were many non-Afghans detained in Afghanistan. So We're not going to argue with you where, because I think we have to decide, we have to make that decision. But to be able to do tactical interrogation,
I got all
professionally,
that. That wasn't my
but
question.
you can't, if we bring them into the United States and they get read their habeas corpus rights, that stops the process of being able to get the kind of information that you can get through very professionally done interrogations. I'm telling you, I've seen it.
Tell you, I've heard that argument 1,000 times.
Okay, I have been involved in thousands of interrogation operations to be able to get to that
So you're
point.
telling me that every law enforcement personnel in the U.S., every FBI agent, gets no useful intelligence out of anybody that they capture in the, because once they Mirandize them, it's over and they can't get any information out of them.
It's a lot slower. And I have been on both sides of it.
Successful.
The ranking member, I've been on both sides of it. I just tell you, and it doesn't mean that we can't have professional law enforcement representatives involved in the process from a detention interrogation process.
I disagree with you on the fact that somehow Miranda instantaneously shuts off the gathering of information. But putting that point aside, there's no reason that, as we've done with some other people, I mean, you have to do that in Guantanamo too. I mean, the same things apply in both places. So I guess the central question is there's no reason that we couldn't do the same thing here in the U.S. that we do in Guantanamo. There's really, Guantanamo does not give us any particular interrogation or detention advantage.
You just have to make sure that, I mean, there's a timeliness issue, and, you have to make sure that the conditions are set for that. I mean, again, that's kind of a legislative to executive discussion about if we bring them into the United States, what does that mean legally? I'm not a lawyer, don't know that, but I just know that there's probably going to be a different set of conditions when we bring them inside of the United States, because we don't have designated combat zones anymore. But wherever they go, we have to be able to capture these individuals to be able to get the intelligence out of them.
There's really no difference at this point between Guantanamo and the U.S. I yield back.
Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, interesting discussion about Guantanamo, and I absolutely, in my home area, we have the largest federal prison ever, and I would just suggest to you, when you detain these folks, whether it's Gitmo or in the U.S., that's the issue. That's going to be the issue to the bad guys and their associated friends and fellows. So I think I agree with the General, when you bring them back to the U.S., being a former law enforcement officer, it just creates a whole bunch of other issues that we have not had to deal with when they're held at Gitmo. The one thing that I'm struggling with the President's request for an authorization, and you hit it on the head, General, is a clear, comprehensive strategy. And what would that look like? I guess that's where I'm struggling. What does a clear, comprehensive strategy look like in regards to dealing with the issue that we have in front of us? Because, we had the King of Jordan here, and his comprehensive strategy is you can't just look at ISIS or ISIL, you got to look at it across the world in regards to Islamic extremism.
So, I mean, we've talked about this business about clearly defining the enemy and making sure that it's comprehensive. And I think that those are sort of two parts of this, and you've just addressed certainly the second one. I think the third one is that we have to really take a hard look at how we are organized as a nation to deal with the sort of the tactical problem of what's happening in Iraq and Syria, but we also have to look at how we're organized as a nation to deal with the wider, longer-term problem of this radical version of Islam. And specifically, it's the Department of Defense, it's the Department of State, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the intelligence community as it supports our national interests. And then I think we have to look at how we're organized internationally. And I've really, I use the NATO model, as a model, although it's got its, shortcomings. But we need to have some sort of Arab world NATO, if you will, like structure, and not deal with each one of these countries as though they're individual countries dealing with individual problems. They're all dealing with those kinds of problems. And I think that we do need to put somebody in charge of it. I think we need to designate someone in charge that has not only the backing of this country and a full line of authority from the President of the United States to execute authorities, and it's probably civilian-led, but it's just somebody with that kind of gravitas, I guess, but also internationally accepted to run this sort of campaign. Now, should it be somebody from the U.S.? I believe it should be somebody from the U.S. Doesn't mean that we have to have large numbers of boots on the ground. It just means that we have to come together, organize ourselves first, make sure that we are organized correctly internationally, and then make sure that somebody's in charge of this effort, and then frankly tell the American public that this is going to last for generations. I mean, this is not something that's going to go away.
To the other panelists,
and the AUMF is not that. It's only a component of it.
and that's, I think, the mistake that people think, that the AUMF is the comprehensive strategy. It is just part of the toolkit in regards to it. The other panelists, in regards to a comprehensive strategy, do you think today, at this point in time, that we have a comprehensive strategy today? Mr. Lynch.
No, I don't. I think that we did a very good job, I think, of assembling a coalition and stopping the immediate crisis, and now is the time when we need to formulate that long-term strategy. I think your question is exactly right. In terms of your specific question about what that strategy might look like, I mean, I could repeat the things I said before about preventing a clash of civilizations and all that. I don't need to say all that, but I really want to emphasize in second and third something that General Flynn said, that if we are going to have any success in dealing with ISIL and with extremism in the Middle East, we have to make sure that our allies are on the same page as we are, because they've been as much the problem as the solution.
Absolutely.
Extraordinarily destructive in Syria and abusive of human rights. And so a comprehensive strategy, I think, has to have that component of political reforms and everything else, or else it's just spitting into the wind.
Mr. Braniff?
I think thus far we've been dealing with issues in an ad hoc basis, and perhaps that's because of the instability associated with the Arab Spring, and frankly, it was a pretty tumultuous few years. I think any strategy has to recognize that al-Qaeda and ISIL have...
Do we have a comprehensive strategy, though, today? Do you believe?
No. I think al-Qaeda and ISIL have pulled us into the realm of non-state actors, where we're largely forced to operate in extrajudicial terms, and outside the international system, where the rules of the game are set up in our favor, and we should try to push this back up into the international system, where again we have those rules working for our favor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. In particular, General Flynn, a fellow Rhode Islander. General, welcome back before the committee, and thank you for your years of service. So I'd like to, probably the question would be for Dr. Lynch and also for General Flynn, whoever wants to go first. I mean, clearly this rise of radical, violent extremists didn't happen overnight. It was allowed to fester in many ways. In many ways, the religious community, for whatever reason, as I understand it, was allowed to preach hate and violence, and a lot of the leaders in the Middle East kind of looked the other way, and for whatever reason. So it kind of took a long time to get here. It's going to take a long time to get out of it. But let me ask you, do the statements from, for example, President al-Sisi in Egypt, which I found surprising but welcome, a welcome statement when he spoke to the religious community there, or established Sunni imams in the greater Middle East who have denounced the violence of ISIL or Islamic extremism more broadly. Do they moderate or counter the nature of the grievances and the threat from jihadists in the region, or are these steps having the reverse effect of reinforcing the jihadist ideology and grievance narrative? Can you comment on that?
I think it's a fantastic question. Thank you. I think that the issue with statements like those by General al-Sisi or President al-Sisi is not the statement itself. It's that he doesn't really have the standing to issue those things, because when he's presiding over a fairly repressive police state and putting tens of thousands of political dissidents in jail, it's very difficult for him to then say, oh, but you must be moderate and you must participate in the political system. And so it gets back exactly to the conversation we were having a moment ago about the need to understand that if you want to have leaders leaders who are capable of making, leaders in the Middle East who are capable of making the kinds of statements that you and I would very much like to see, they need to have the standing from which to do so, and right now they don't. The Saudis have been in a very difficult position on this. The Egyptians have been in a very difficult position. And so the traditional leaders of the Arab world are not in a very strong position right now to make the kinds of moves for moderation and against extremism that we need to see.
So real quickly, this shift in the strengthening of this ideology started well before 9/11. 9/11 just brought it to the fore. I mean, it really was, it just showed how dedicated and how long-term their vision is of what it is that they believe. And I believe that President al-Sisi's remarks back in the late December, January timeframe, he was talking to the Egyptian people as much as he was talking to the Arab world. And we should not lose sight of that. So despite the challenges that Egypt faces internally to try to get back to a sense of stability and security, we need leaders like that, frankly, more of them around the Arab world that are willing to step up and say the kinds of things that he said that took a lot of courage. But he also knows that he has to change inside of their own system, just in Egypt alone, to be able to get the people to sort of come back around to be more moderate. And they're dealing with they're dealing with Al-Qaeda, and they're dealing with elements of a radical, version of the Muslim Brotherhood in that country. So I was very heartened when I heard President al-Sisi come out and make those remarks.
Yeah. So are there things that we can focus on in our strategy to help encourage that kind of moderation? But let me ask you also, given that there are certain actors in the region, such as the UAE and Jordan, among others, who appear to be supporting U.S. interests, how should the United States support and organize these partners in the region to serve as potentially moderating influences within the greater Middle East?
Thank you, Congressman. So I think one thing we can do, we know that the U.S. government is gun-shy to talk about what is moderate Islam and what should Islam be, and other leaders in the Muslim world don't always have the credibility to talk about moderating Islam and have actually that carry authority. But one thing that leaders can do is try to collectively decrease the perceived social legitimacy of violence, which is not talking about what kind of Islam is right or wrong, but it's lowering that threshold that sparks sort of revulsion against terrorist organizations so that they step over that line more quickly. And this is something that I think we can do collectively.
Let me add one other comment, and that has to do with the rule of law. And I think that's probably a strategic advantage that this country has. If there's one thing that we need to export around the world, not so much democracy, but the idea of rule of law. So people are governed by norms and behaviors that are acceptable internationally. And I think that that's a problem in this part of the world right now.
Thank you all. I yield back.
As you all know, they've called votes. I think we'll have time probably to get two more folks in. Mr. Cook?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Flynn, first of all, I noticed you went to University of Rhode Island.
First land-grant university in the country, established by Abraham Lincoln, actually established that law.
I know, but my daughter went there and my son-in-law. I just want to know why the out-of-state tuition is so high. No, I'm only...
I defer to my colleague.
Going back to Dr. Heck's question about the airfield, which is in the news right now and everything else. And I think a lot of us are wondering whether this is a symbolic thing in terms of a targeting, in terms of mortars and indirect fire weapons, because of the fact that there's Marines there, a chance to embarrass the Marines. As you know, Fallujah, I think, was a major, major political propaganda victory for them because of the number of soldiers, sailors, and Marines that were killed in that city. And I'm trying to see if you had a take on whether psychologically that would be a huge victory if, they had tremendous casualties or what have you. And that's the #1 press story, I think. Can you comment on that? And secondly, I want you to address our lack of human intelligence. I know you talked about feedback from prisoners, but thank you.
Yeah. So the fact that this tactical action by ISIS is going on right now in essentially the village or town of Baghdadi is a strategic victory for them. It's definitely a strategic information victory for them. And they're very close into Al-Assad, and there's been, I mean, I've been to Al-Assad a number of times. We operated out of there very effectively. If I were those Marines in there, I would, be looking to make sure that we are absolutely within, that we have the rules of engagement very clearly understood to be able to deal with anything that happens against those perimeters of that particular base. What I would love to see, an unleashing of some Iraqi force with the support of our U.S. Marines to go after and retake that little village, because that would be doable. And it would be something that the Iraqis could actually do with the support of our U.S. Marine forces that are in Al-Assad. In terms of human, we lack the kind of human intelligence that we need, that we used to have actually pretty, we developed it over time, but we don't have that kind of level that we need today. And interrogations is actually a part of that.
Since I still got 2 minutes, I just wanted, you talked about the plans and everything like that. I used to be a plans officer 100 years ago. And we're talking about the budget and everything else. And one of my big arguments is the tempo of ops compared with, it's just out of control. You got to do this, 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 and this. We used to have a vault with all the op plans in it and everything else. And I'm wondering, are we out of control because we have a brigade for this, we have a squadron for this, we just don't have enough military forces to go around for all the commitments? And if you could briefly comment on that.
Right. We do not. We do not have, if you look at the menu that the national security strategy currently is in terms of the layout of threats around the world, and particularly this problem that we're facing right now, our military is so stretched thin and frankly under-resourced, and parts of it are not trained to the level that we would expect them to be, that the American public would expect them to be at. So, and the sequestration, and you all know this, is just choking the readiness of the United States military. And we need to decide what kind of military do we want to have given the threats that we face. And right now, it's grown, it's gotten too small, and if we continue down this path, it's going to get even smaller. And that's a danger to our national security. So leave it at that.
Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'll try to be brief. And Dr. Lynch, I want to go to one of the statements that you made about the fact that terrorism is ebbing and flowing. We shouldn't pay too much attention to it. That's just going to happen the way the Middle East is, if you will. But I'd like to have this submitted for the record and wonder if you've seen this. This is the DIA intelligence assessment from 2004 to 2014. In 2004, we were dealing with 21 total terrorist groups in 18 total countries, and today we're dealing with 41 terrorist groups in 24 countries. Certainly respect your opinion and agree with it on many things, but I would suggest that that's more than an ebb and flow. That is a significant growth in an ideology that's dangerous to the world. What would you assess the population of the Islamic extremists or terrorists, whatever we want to call them, in Iraq to be, the total number of them?
Thank you, Congressman. I want to clarify. When I was talking about ebb and flow, I was talking about civil war dynamics, not terrorism. I was talking about the fighting on the ground in Syria specifically. So I'm sorry for that confusion.
And for the record, the U.S. Working to undermine Assad and move him out. I've read some of your statements on Syria. I personally think the U.S. made a mistake, and when we undermine those leaders in those countries, we end up creating a vacuum that allows these extremist groups to expand. but I've read some of your statements there. But the total number for Iraq, if you would.
Right. No, I just wanted to clarify that because the ebb and flow is really about the civil wars, and the question of whether we should have gone after Assad is a question for another day. I would say that if you go country by country, you get wildly different estimates. So, for example, there's an Islamic State affiliate supposedly in Algeria, which might have 20 people in it.
If I can, but look.
So in Iraq, what I would say is that was your specific question.
Yes, sir.
You might have something along the lines of what would you say, Bill? Maybe 5,000 dedicated ISIS or ISIL fighters combined with a whole set of local forces who have aligned with them.
Let's use that number.
Yeah.
I'm trying to move fast because I want to give my colleague the opportunity to ask her question as well. How many fighting age men are in that country?
Good question. 17 million, maybe? 15 million?
Okay.
But those are Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites, and therefore, so if you're talking only about the Sunni community.
Here's my point, and this is what I want to come back to you on, General. If there are 5,000 Islamic extremist terrorists, whatever we want to call them, inside a country that has 5 million fighting age men, no matter what battle we win, if we get the rules of engagement right, they've got, if they are moderates, that's a 50,000 to 1 margin. And if 50,000 to 1 isn't enough of an advantage, then what is? So this is why so many people in our part of the world identify this as Islam, because clearly 50,000 could overrun 1 if they wanted to. And so, General Flynn, my question for you specifically, if we get the rules of engagement right, which I certainly don't trust the President on, but if we get the rules of engagement right, there's no doubt in my mind that we can win any battle over there. But if they in Iraq have a 50,000 to 1 margin versus the Islamic terrorist, and they can't control that, what good can we do?
Yeah, so I was asked a question back in 2002 when I was first in Afghanistan, and I was asked, how many enemy are we facing in Afghanistan at that time, 2002. This was April-May timeframe, 2002. And I said, we're looking at about 35,000. So the next question was, okay, so if we kill or capture all 35,000, can we go home? Do we win? And the next part of that answer was, no, because there's another 500,000 on the other side of the border in this place called the Fatah. So it's the same sort of analogy today. We can capture and kill all day long, but until we deal with, these others that are there, these other millions or whatever that number is, we're going to be at this a long time. And that's why the military component of this makes us feel good when we do something. We kill somebody, we get a leader, but it's all the others that are there, ready to join this movement and fight against our value system. And that's just something that we're going to have to. That's the wider strategy that we need.
And that's where I think training and equipping and supporting our allies becomes the most important part of this strategy.
Exactly.
Working people with
across the region.
Absolutely.
Ms. McSally, I think we've got time for a couple questions if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. It's been very informative. A lot of my questions have been answered. Quick question about trends in Africa. I was a part of the team at U.S. Africa Command, running current operations there, and just your comments. We've talked a little bit about Boko Haram, but AQIM and Al-Shabaab and the trends you're seeing with those organizations, and there's plenty of ungoverned spaces that are potential, and we've seen foreign fighters flow in and out in the past when many people weren't paying attention. So any comments on the trends going on in the rest of those organizations on the African continent?
Well, I'll defer to Bill on a lot of the details. The one thing I will talk about is Libya and the effect that that's having. I think that you are seeing the emergence of what looks like an Islamic State affiliate in Libya. It's a completely ungoverned space, and it's now a civil war, total polarization, and that's having destabilizing effects on both East and West. The Egyptians are extremely worried about it. Tunisians are very, very worried about it. And so, so basically the lesson is when you get the collapse of the state, and it opens the space for these groups. And so I'm very worried about Libya for all kinds of reasons, but that's one of them.
Great, thanks.
Briefly, because I think I know Bill has something to offer on this as well. The negative is that it is rapidly growing. Okay, so it's getting worse in those couple, particularly those couple of areas that you just talked about. And the other part is, as Mark just highlighted, the breakdown of the nation state, right, or the order of the nation state, if you will, in parts of that region. The positive is that there are countries that understand it and are trying to come to grips with it, and that's more down in the, I mean, there's a number of them. These I think it's 7 countries that are trying to work against Boko Haram right now that have come together. There's some economies there, particularly down in the central and southern part of Africa that are good models for the rest of Africa. But the size of the population in the 15 to 30-year-old category of young men that have nothing better to do than to join these groups is probably the fastest growing population demographic on the planet today.
Exactly. Great, thank you. And I yield back. I know we're going to go vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your time.
Thank the gentlelady, and thank you all for being here. As many topics as we got to today, we didn't get to everything. I'm sorry, Mr. Brandt, did you have something you want to add on that last point?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. Al-Shabaab conducted twice as many attacks in the first 9 months of 2014 as they did in all of 2013. Boko Haram will likely be either the most or the second most lethal terrorist organization in 2014 when we finalize our data, although they're not the most active in terms of number of attacks, which means that they're unfortunately quite efficient in creating fatalities per attack. And of course, we just saw their first attack in Chad a day or so ago, and continued attacks in now Cameroon. And there's another group in Nigeria that's among the 10 most active groups of 2014, a group called the Fulani, or associated with the Fulan tribes. So what we're seeing is increased levels of terrorist attacks and fatalities both in West Africa and in East Africa associated with Shabaab, and a lot of fluidity in North Africa.
Thank you. And I think it is helpful to have some objective measurements to gauge these things. They don't tell us the whole story, but they do enable us to compare trends. The other topic we didn't really get to today, which I think we need to understand better, is this competition among groups. You alluded to it. We didn't quite have a chance to get to it, but I think that is a very significant factor that we have not fully explored. But we did get to a number of things. Again, I apologize. We're getting cut short a little bit because of votes, but I very much appreciate each of you being here and assisting the committee. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.
As this hearing comes to a close, members are heading over to the House chamber to vote in a procedural motion on extending tax breaks for small businesses. You can see the House live on our companion network, C-SPAN. Also, if you missed any of this hearing, you can watch it again anytime on our website at cspan.org. Also on ISIS this